Cold War era.
Perfect, or did you have some problems maybe?
NRV is stuck.
Can't wait to see the video.
May God bless your team and the endeavor you're on.
Well, here we are again, folks, and welcome back to the Halifax 57 Rescue Show. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of nuts and bolts and wonderful history here. And I can vouch for you, Scott, that we're progressing with the Bristol Hercules engines, just like that 1,600 horsepower engine coming out of the back of your head. And you go ahead, do the airframe. But remember, Karl is working on those big bastards back in Nanton. And I'll just tell you this, folks, if you've ever tried to tune up a 1,600 horsepower engine and you have to get the timing just critical at the correct timing for all 14 cylinders, you ain't seen nothing yet. And so my main man, Hugh, is doing the timing. I'm assisting him, and we're getting the timing right. We're almost ready to start. And remember, when you start a Bristol Hercules engine after 50 years, who knows what the heck is going to happen. So, but we've done our best due diligence, and we'll be ready to start. So that's my end, Scott, just working away. So let us know what you've been doing, man.
Well, we got to build something for you to hang these engines off of, right? Because they're not just going to roll around on the floor. So we're progressing with the trailing edge. And now we're actually progressing into parts that are original parts. Up until this point, we were fabricating and installing parts that we created. Now the last few ribs in the trailing edge are original parts that we have. So we're getting very close to the end of the trailing edge rib assembly. And then a few weeks after this, then we'll start skimming, we hope. And that should be hopefully coming up soon. But this time around, we're working on the original trailing edge ribs.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And now we've got a human interest story. It's very personal and really delves into the history of aviation in the 1950s and 1960s. And we're going to take a special tour led by the late General Paul Manson. And he took us to a nuclear bunker west of our nation's capital and showed us the Diefenbunker, which was built in case of nuclear war. So really weird and wonderful. It's history, and led by giving us a tour by General Paul Manson, combat pilot from the 1950s and 60s, who ended up general in the Canadian military.
I'm General Retired Paul Manson, retired from the Canadian Armed Forces as Chief of Defence Staff back in 1989, a long time ago.
That's a nuclear weapon, very early nuclear weapon.
We're presently in the Diefenbunker, a fascinating museum of military history that covers the Cold War era. The question's often asked about whether Canada, Canadian cities, Canadian military centers would be targets in the event of an attack by the Soviet Union, either by bombers or by ICBMs later on in the era. There's no real answer, no known answer to that question yet, although I suspect that somewhere buried in the archives in Moscow they would have target lists from those days. But the consensus pretty well is that their principal targets were south of the border in the United States. Because clearly the Soviets, if they were to launch a nuclear attack, would want to be sure that they could do damage to the American retaliatory capability, the American bombers and the American missile silos. Cities, of course, would be a target, maybe Washington, D.C., perhaps New York City. But as far as Canada is concerned, we suspect that we were pretty low on their target priority list. Ottawa itself could very well have been a target. We'll never know that. But places like North Bay, which control the air defense facilities in Canada, would most likely be a Soviet target as well. But regardless of where the targets were located, the fact is that if it were a massive nuclear attack against North America, there would be problems with this part of the world, largely from fallout. Radioactive materials from nuclear detonations across the continent could drift across this area and make it difficult or impossible for Canadians to be outdoors, which is why the Canadian government would want to get away from the city centre in Ottawa and establish itself underground where it's protected from fallout and from nuclear attack so that it can carry on the business of government. Of course, like all maps of the world, this projection doesn't give a good picture of our globe, and there are distortions. But in fact, the Soviets would launch a bomber attack, particularly across Canada, would in fact be a straight line, but it would then come down over the Canadian Arctic, down through the center of Canada, perhaps eastern Canada as well, aiming for major targets south of the border in the United States. And the same would be true of ICBMs, except that launching sites, Soviet launching sites, would be far further inland, because the range isn't nearly as much of a problem as it would be for manned bombers, which do have limited range. And they would want to launch from areas as close to their targets as they possibly could, so they had at least a reasonable ability of flying back to their home bases after the attack. We're standing now in the medical facility inside the Diefenbunker. It's interesting because it's basically a miniature hospital. And that was necessary because in those days, the Diefenbunker, if it was sealed off in the context of a nuclear war, had to be very self-contained for the more than 500 people who lived and worked in this facility for as long as 30 days without access to the outside. So the medical center was important, and it has a pretty good capability for looking after those people, including minor operations, treatments of injuries, wounding, and looking after people who might have been exposed to radiation during a nuclear attack. The people who were working in this Diefenbunker facility, it was a pretty mixed bag, but almost entirely from the government and the military, civilian and military personnel who were responsible for basically what might be called continuation of government, making sure the government continues to operate in the context of a post-nuclear attack, or even in preparation for a threatening nuclear attack against Canada and the Western world by the Soviet Union in those days. So the people who worked here were all the way from the Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, very senior military officers, government officials, ministers had their own personal staffs and their own little operating areas within the Diefenbunker, looking after their particular interests in a time of terrible crisis for the nation. We're looking now at a plastic model of the whole of the Diefenbunker complex. And as you can see from this model, there were 4 levels. It was a huge facility, basically dug into the ground, and it took something like 32,000 cubic yards of concrete to build, 5,000 tons of steel to put it all together. It took several years to build. It was an enormous engineering undertaking. But it does include all of the facilities that were needed to keep the Canadian government operating in time of a nuclear attack during the worst days of the Cold War. The Diefenbunker was the central government underground facility for survival of the nation when it was under nuclear attack. But there were a number of other of these deep bunkers across Canada. In fact, a good many of them, several dozen. None of them as big as this one. The only one that would match its complexity and its size would be the NORAD, the Northern NORAD facility based at North Bay, which in fact was not the same type of a facility. It was an military operational center for control of air defense against incoming bombers and eventually missile attack as well too. And it was a huge underground facility, but this was the largest one of its kind across Canada. This Diefenbunker was designed to look after some 500 key individuals during a crisis. There was, believe it or not, enough fresh food kept in the facility to keep all of them eating well for the first 7 days, for the first week. Beyond that, they had to go on to rations for another 3 weeks. But they could keep the whole 500 plus people alive and well for as long as 1 month without any of them ever stepping outside of the facility. Well, I'm sitting in a chair that might have been occupied, for example, by the Minister of National Defense, sitting beside the Prime Minister, looking at a screen that depicts the whole of the terrible situation that was facing the country at that time, and deciding what might and what had to be done to cope with all of these crises. And you can see there's some fancy telephones sitting on the table here, old vintage telephone, dial telephone, so that gives you an idea of the era about which we're talking, would be the late 50s and perhaps the early 60s. There's a red telephone whose purpose might have been for the Prime Minister to get in touch with the President of the United States, because there's some very important decisions.
So, Karl, while I was back in Canada and you were overseas pulling up NA337, I know everything was so well planned. Everything went out without a hitch, right? Was it perfect, or did you have some problems maybe?
Yes, we had problems. And as you say, there's the plan. But when you go to plan A and you get sabotaged, you got to go to plan B. And Doug Armorud and his Daycon guys, guess what? They were circling around the Halifax with their mini sub, their AUV, sorry, not AUV, ROV. And they got the umbilical cord of our first ROV tangled in the Halifax and the lifting device. So we were stuck on the bottom of a 700-foot deep lake. We couldn't get our submarine up. We couldn't get our Halifax up. And so there was a lot of head scratching and hand wringing. And
so did it just get wrapped around Moby grip, or did it get caught up in the propellers, or what?
Well, yeah, a little bit of everything. And the problem was you didn't have a map, a live map of where is the ROV and where is the airplane. So it's kind of like we were flying blind around our target.
Right.
And so the end result was we were stuck. So Doug came up with a great idea of let's bring in a second ROV with a mechanical hand. And this was critical. They had to figure out how to untangle what they had tangled. And thank God they did it.
Good stuff.
It took a long time and we were sitting on pins and needles. But in every victory, there is a moment when you must push forward to victory. And those guys wouldn't give up. They're kind of like Canadians. They ain't giving up till it's over. And it ain't over till it's over.
Press on regardless.
Yeah. And they did a beautiful job of untangling. And very soon we had victory with the Halifax coming up. But we were sweating bullets for a while there, buddy.
Good stuff. We can't wait to see the video.
I don't know if it has been done any time before to lift the plane remote control from 220 meters. I don't think so. So it's more or less the first time. I would like to see the plane on land, and I would like to fly it someday. So therefore we have to be very careful. But I'm sorry for Karl. He has worked so hard for this project, and that he had to leave us tonight or tomorrow morning, that's really bad, But I hope we can come back on another trip to London, and you can see it inside house, working with the first steps of restoration.
Maybe I can't be here, but I got the best damn team.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have to have something to eat
Yeah.
before we go out. For the workers, we have to stay out there for at least 24 hours, or maybe 30, before we have anything to eat again, maybe. If not, Patricia's coming out with a small boat.
I will. I will.
And but no sleep within the first 24 hours, I would guess.
May God bless your team and the endeavor you're on.
Thank you.
Cheers. Cheers.
Cheers.
On board the barge, measures were being taken to prepare the lifting device for the final descent. Martin helped Thor into his diving gear, and after double-checking the hoses, he entered the water to inspect the device. Constant radio contact was strictly maintained for safety reasons. This was heavy equipment, and although Daycon had worked in many situations like this, it was only wise to protect the lives of everyone involved. The lifting device weighed over 2,500 pounds, and the cable attached to the winch was deemed strong enough to lift the entire aircraft from the bottom. After 30 minutes, Thor returned to the surface. The lifting device was ready. As the early morning light approached, more supplies were brought to the barge from shore. It was an intriguing sight to see this strange-looking barge out in the middle of a Norwegian lake. But everyone living there knew what was happening. The word was out, and people were beginning to take notice of this important historical event. Secondary cables were now being prepared for the device. Each corner would be attached to balance the structure. Once onto the plane, the wires would be used to guide and stabilize the lifting unit. Dag made a final walkthrough and began to inspect the entire operations mechanism. With the order to commence, the lifting device slowly descended into the depths of Lake Mjøsa. At the same time, the ROV would be required to follow Moby grip to the bottom, so the crew unloaded the robot and let it slip gently into the water. It would dive 237 meters to the plane's location and relay television signals back to the control room. The crew was confident and eager to complete this project. Some had not seen their wives or loved ones for some time. There was just so much waiting a team of salvage experts like these could handle. The patience was paying off. Everything was finally working. Then, without warning, the unexpected happened.
Yeah, the main ROV is stuck, and we don't like to go further on with the lifting device before we know exactly what position it is, and eventually try to pick it up before we're lifting the plane, so we don't destroy anything.
Ligger alt for det? A second ROV was brought in by truck. Similar to the Daycon remote operating vehicle, this underwater robot was on a mission to search, locate, and untangle the Daycon probe. They had lost the sub once before when they were bringing up the tail. The ballast tanks on the side of the unit are designed to raise the ROV automatically to the surface if the main cables are ever disconnected. In that incident, after a few hours, the system had worked. This time, it was different. The ROV was caught, and these cables were too deep for a diver to reach without special equipment. With their remote control devices, the two men spun a robotic web as the ROVs danced underwater. With each attempt, the web was untangling. The stress level was riding high. Without the ROV, the mission was in jeopardy. Suddenly, with the crew gently tugging on the cable, the ROV was free. Dag and gunner were relieved. As the two ROVs made their way to the surface, you could not help but think these machines were really an intricate part of the crew. You could sense the relief on Dag's face as the Daycon ROV reached the surface. Like a long-lost pet, the stubborn ROV was back, and the crew was ready to start again.
Well, that about wraps it up for this program, folks. And Scott, I've been working so damn hard on these Bristol Hercules engines. I'm too tired, but I need you to put some peer pressure on our viewers. So let her rip, and let's sign off with you, buddy.
Right on. Well, yeah, another great show. So while we're doing all this work and taking all of our spare time to remember Canadian Airmen, we're asking you, the viewer, to please just take the time to like and subscribe the videos, and please share and give us any comments you have. And if you have any questions about the project, please leave a comment. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. But please like and subscribe. Every little bit of support that we have, maybe even if it's not monetarily, just liking and subscribing and supporting the channel goes a long way. And if we know that there's people out there watching, then it makes all this effort worthwhile. So again, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.
Great, great. And remember, we leave no Halifax behind. Save this Halifax for history and for Canada.